In this short video, two members of the OODA Network, Bob Flores and Junaid Islam, both experts in international relations, geopolitics, technology, strategy, and corporate leadership, talk about the geopolitical risk coming out of China. And they do so from the context of what should corporate boards know and do about this. We also talk about the 25 October 2023 OODAcon, which will be held here in Reston, Virginia. Enjoy. Bob and Junaid, welcome back. Today we want to discuss some of the dynamics with the geopolitical relationship with China. As an introduction, let me start with some context, long term. If we look at, like, say, the last 10 years, the arc that we have been on, 10 years ago, there were a lot of national security concerns with China, a lot of cybersecurity concerns, but it seems like most of those concerns were from the national defense perspective. The DoD was waking up to this concept of great power competition returning. Everybody wants peace, and that desire for peace and cooperation was still leading most people to believe that, look, we are so tightly coupled with China, we're just going to have to be coupled forever, and maybe we can influence them a little bit. But over the last 10 years, there were then tensions. There was a trade war, a tariff war, as we really got collectively fed up with the unfair treatment. Then, as the crisis around COVID took effect, of course, China's economy slowed. The U.S. economy briefly slowed. For a while, it looked like China was going to do better in COVID. But then the lockdowns happened. Their economy was frozen. In the U.S., there were supply chain issues because of that. It woke up a lot of companies, even more companies, to the threat from China. As they were coming out of that, Russia's invasion of Ukraine woke up even more people to the threat of dealing with these totalitarian nations and underscored the importance of our own self-reliance. Now we see the economy of China still slow. The U.S. came super close to a full-scale recession. It looks like we may be in for a soft landing. Maybe it's not going to be a horrible recession, but we have been buying less stuff from China, and it is having an effect. The recent news of their slowdown has just been even more dramatic than people thought. So, as we have been predicting at OODA for about 4 years, their economy is weakening. And what I wanted to ask you two guys is to discuss a thesis that many of us have about what this slowdown in China's economy might mean for corporate boards that are concerned with the cyber threat from China. A lot of us believe this means that the cyber threat from China is actually going to increase, because there's even less reason for China to want to cooperate with international institutions and support the rule of law. There's even more motivation for them to want to steal things that will give them financial benefit, either intellectual property or information on what other businesses are doing, which means corporate boards need to be more aware of this threat. And would love it if both of you react to this thesis. And Bob, would you give us your thoughts?
Sure, and I'm glad you mentioned the intellectual property issue, because the cyber threat in cybersecurity issues they're just a means to an end, right? I mean, this is what China and others do to gain a foothold. They're not typically in China. They're not going after your corporate network just to say, hey, we hacked their network. No, they have a goal in mind, and that's to steal your IP. And I think your thesis is correct. I don't believe that any of this is going to slow down. If anything, we'll probably see an uptick. And we all have to be aware of this, and we all have to be cognizant of the fact that everybody is a target here. When you are running a country that you want to be the world dominating country, then you'll reach out for anything that can give you an edge. And so I know in my own dealings, I have talked to many CEOs who said, yeah, we understand that that this is a threat here, and but not us. And it reminds me of the teenager, which we all once were, saying, oh yeah, it's too bad that guy, died in that car wreck, but that won't happen to me. And so it is going to be an increasing thing. I think you're also going to see, because we are so reliant on China for many, many things, you're going to see further disruptions in supply chain as this moves on. That's one thing that China can do, is they can slow down the supply chain. Basically, it will, and so we have to be cognizant of that. That's going to happen. So all this is it's going to take a finessing, by the government and by industry. And I think more importantly, it really drives home the fact that we need more and more government industry partnerships around all this. Anyway, those are my quick 2 cents.
Great. Thanks, Bob. Junaid?
From my perspective, I think boards need to look at the China risk, business risk very carefully and take it very seriously because of 3 things that have happened in the last month, which signal that China is moving to a much more aggressive footing. The first one is, and this is not, they're all big 3. China has been openly talking about creating an alternative currency to the US dollar at the BRICS conference in South Africa, to the point that, first they thought it was just them and Russia, but they're getting the support of a number of countries, of all things, Saudi Arabia and India, which are supposedly US allies. This should be very worrying for all corporate boards working across the world. This means China's working seriously on this. China would not have made a public statement without approval of other countries. They are very careful about what they say publicly. So the fact that an alternative currency is going through, the boards in the Western world, the United States, should look at new trade deals, of which they'll cut out America. Guaranteed in those trade deals, to Bob Flores's point, will ensure that they can steal intellectual property with no recourse. They're going to squeeze that in somehow, and you just know they're going to do it. They're going to legitimize the BRICS ecosystem and say we're self-contained and we don't care about others, meaning us. The second thing we need to look at carefully is the naval flotilla that continues to encircle Taiwan. The reason this is important is people talk a lot about war with Taiwan and how the probability is low. While true war where people die is probably not probable because they don't want to destroy Taiwan, they do want to take control. So for them to encircle Taiwan and just deem it to be a part of China and say, you have to go through customs clearance, they can do it today. Now, the US Navy has been doing the freedom of navigation, and here's the interesting thing. They can do that without disrupting US Navy ships. They'll be like, yeah, sure, come on, and just sail right, just keep on going. In fact, we'll make it easy for you to come and go. And they can still blockade Taiwan, which is a different issue. They can just, Chinese warships just can sit on outside the Taiwanese ports and just say it's ours. And you can still come to Taiwan, but you have to get a visa and you have to pay your Chinese tax, right? And that would be horrific. And then the third thing we need to take a hard look at is what happened in Ukraine. When Vladimir Putin took Ukraine, the world community complained, and the world community thought their complaints would be enough to stop it. Here we are heading really at the 1.5 year mark. We're going right into the 2-year mark, and he is not stopping at all. And what he has shown is the weakness of Western democracies to push back visibly. This has given the CCP leadership a lot of confidence. It's had the opposite effect. If he had stopped during the sanctions, everybody would have said, "Ooh, you're right. The world community can really lock this down." If anything, last week the Russians and the Saudi Arabia bilaterally announced production cuts in synchronization. That is just horrific. That means our ally Saudi Arabia is openly dealing with Russia against the United States. Who does this help? It helps Vladimir Putin, but who does this super empower? China. This takes us back to this issue of what should boards do. They really need to accept the fact that there will be a conflict with China. Doesn't mean people are getting shot, but it does mean a naval blockade. It means a new trade agreement. It needs a new currency. This all has to be factored into your global operation. So even if you're not dealing directly with China and China is your main partner, perhaps you deal with Southeast Asia. All of Southeast Asia is going to be impacted by this. The Malaysians, the Indonesians, they're already recalibrating their economy. If you're working with India, India is now making some big decisions, and China is trying to work hard with India and putting them in their orbit, not the US orbit. If you're working in India, you need to look at this carefully. So just don't look at it in the narrow China lens. Look at what China's doing globally, and then look at the exposure your company has around the world, whether supply chain or markets.
Another thing you underscore there, which I really like, Junaid, is the fact that cyber and intellectual property and actions taken to benefit China financially are not limited in one stovepipe. It's not just cyber or intellectual property theft. It's also things like China has been caught creating shell companies in the US to buy other US shell companies, or to buy the intellectual property of companies, or to bankrupt adversaries. So the way that you describe the geopolitical realities around this make me want to underscore the fact that this is a broad threat. It's not a narrow one subject threat. And corporate boards need to understand this and think of the systemic risk that they are in, especially risk of their supply chains that may come under the influence of China.
That's right. There's both a direct threat through China funding competitors of U.S. companies and using their massive war chest of U.S. dollars, and sadly using private equity firms in New York to do the transaction, to indirect threat, which is also lethal. The supply chain is kind of lethal because it's hidden. And where we saw this right here in America is in communications infrastructure. We had this notion of American made, and then that kind of went away. And then we said, well, okay, it's okay if you're Europe or America. But then we looked at the components going into. I did a lot of work in 5G. A lot of the components and software ended up coming from outside of America. And now to unwind that is very difficult because China bought companies and then deep discounted their product. They effectively drove companies out of business in the United States. So you have this inverted business model. Why would you start a company in America to do 5G infrastructure? It's like impossible. You're going to spend $100 million and you're going to make $1,000 a tower. Well, that doesn't work because China's deeply subsidized their thing. So we have this asymmetry that really is cutting into corporate America.
All right. So now, Bob, let me ask you to comment on this from the perspective of, let's assume that the government, our U.S. government, is going to move kind of slow. Maybe they're moving in the right direction, and that's good. But corporations should not just sit and wait around. What kind of things should a corporate board be thinking about when it comes to mitigating the risk of operating in this environment?
Well, the first thing they need to do is and most of the boards they know how to do this. They've just never done it in this context before, or haven't done it very often in this context, and that's due diligence. And so they need to make sure that they are performing due diligence on their third-party folks to see who's really behind the curtain. And we see this time and time again with certain venture capital firms, for example. And you dig behind the curtain and you find out, oh gosh, the high rollers here are people sitting in Beijing. And so it's great from a capitalistic standpoint, but then it adds to the fodder. So I think that's number one. They need to, number one, they need to understand that there actually is a threat. And then number two, part of that threat is in your supply chain, whether that's the AC guy or the parts that you need to make whatever it is you make. And the suppliers of those things, you need to do proper due diligence on to find out who's feeding them. And I don't mean who's feeding them stuff necessarily, but who's feeding them intellect, who's controlling the scene for those companies. And if it is China, then you've got some soul searching to do. You know, at the end of the day, you're a company, you're trying to make a profit. You may say, okay, we're going to go ahead and do this, but keep an eye on it. Or you may say, we got to find somebody else, you know, so.
Cool, great insight. Hey, and I also wanted to say, you know, all these kind of issues are so interrelated with the many other things we deal with at OODA. We track the future of technology risk, cyber. We track space, the risk to space, the threat to space from China and Russia and others. We track as many geopolitical issues as we think are relevant to corporate boards and directors. And these are the kind of topics that we are going to be diving deeper into at OODAcon on 25 October here in Reston. So for everybody, please visit our website at OODAloop.com. Click on the button that says OODAcon. Read the agenda. Look at the topics we're going to be hitting. We're going to dive much deeper into geopolitical risk, but we will also be talking about the future of biological sciences, the future of money and cryptocurrency, the future of zero trust. We will also be talking specifically about space. We have the Chief Technology Officer of U.S. Space Force who will be addressing us. So OODAcon is the place to come to dive deeper into all of these issues. With that, Bob, Junaid, any closing comments?
Be on your toes. You know, things are not, they're not really any different than they were 10 years ago, frankly. The technology for China to succeed in what it wants to do has gotten better. You know, we can, at some future date, we'll talk about AI and how does AI play into all this, but which it does. But that's, you know, I think that's my exiting message here is you've got to stay aware.
Right. Junaid?
Yeah, and just to build on Bob Flores's comment, there is no escape. There's no easy button. You know, the reality is our global economy is changing. There are players, specifically people like Russia and China, who do not play by international rules, and it's very hard in the American context to understand that. But that's the reality we live in, and this is something that affects everybody. Everybody's involved in the international market, whether you are or not. Even if you're selling locally, the guaranteed all your parts are coming from somewhere else, and the money's coming from somewhere else. So, you know, as Bob mentioned, that you know, you have to really become aware, and when you make business decisions, especially as a public company, you need to factor all of this in your decision making. And with that, hope to see people at OODAcon if they're interested.
Yep, me too.
All right. Thanks, Bob. Thanks, Junaid.
Sure.